Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Francisca Blanc with Utah Housing Coalition. This is part of our monthly meetings. It's the first meeting after the legislative session, and we will be providing the legislative review for this session. And I want to thank our speakers who join us. We have Ashley Spadafore-Mirabelli with Capstone Strategies, Carson Ehlers with Utah League of Cities and Towns, Ginger Chin with Salt Lake Chamber, and Jean Hill with Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. And thank you for everybody in the attendance. If you have questions for our speakers, please put them in a Q&A. That way it will be easier for me to track them. Usually we do Q&A at the end of the meeting, but because Carson and Ashley both have to be at the meeting in person right at 12, I'm gonna allow them to present first, and then we'll do a Q&A right after. So I would like Ashley to start her presentation.
Francisca, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for pulling this all together. It's a great panel, and you know, it was a big year for housing, very complex, but a lot of really great things. And so really happy to be here. I'll start running through some bills, and you know, anybody else in the group can chime in as well if I've missed something. HB 36 is Representative Waldrop. It's Commission on Housing Affordability. Simple bill, but what this did was the Commission on Housing Affordability actually had a sunset on it, and it was its kind of own independent commission. What this bill does is it now brings it under the newly created from last year, the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission. And so now it'll be an official subcommittee within that commission, the Economic Commission. And also included in this bill is an additional seat, an additional member, and that is for the State Homeless Coordinator, which is Wayne Niederhauser. So the membership has increased. Went through a bunch of iterations, but this is where the final bill ended. And it you know, I think there's some pros and cons. You know, some folks are worried about if it's part of Unified Economic Commission, or is it going to get watered down? Or are other things going to be, you know, seen as more important? Are we going to lose the deeply affordable and really, really deeply affordable aspect of the commission? And I think a lot of folks did a lot of really great things of bringing those topics to the forefront. And I think it's been, you know, made public. I think there's been pretty good reception from that. And I think you know, that there needs to be the larger affordability conversation, but also the really specified deeply affordable conversation. So that's HB 36. Shifting now to HB 151, Representative Schultz, retail incentives, retail facility incentive payments amendments. So ask why you ask, is this on the list, retail incentives? And I think a large part is when our state is starting to talk about housing, not as an individual and isolated topic. It is talking how it relates to other parts of our city, other parts of our transportation, other parts of how we plan for cities, which I think is very good. So this is a very long and complicated bill that really basically talks about what incentives, tax incentives, cities or RDAs can provide to prospective developers, businesses, organizations, and things like that. But as what it's trying to do and how it affects housing is retail incentives, direct retail incentives for retailers are no longer allowed, except under certain conditions. And so some of those conditions are, as it relates to housing, or kind of more in this group that would find interest to, retail incentives can be given to areas that have census tracts that with 51% or greater below 70% the median income. Like, so, you know, if there's food deserts or areas where there's lack of services, and because of the income level, retail incentives can be given. Also, mixed use development and housing. So retail incentives can be used for development if for every 1,250 square feet of retail, there is one housing unit. So they're really trying to get, if you're making these mixed use developments, a city or an RDA can use retail incentives. Or if there is 10% or more of housing dedicated to moderate housing, not affordable, but moderate. So that's that 80% AMI or below. So really it's trying to say, if you're going to use certain incentives, there's got to be a portion of housing. And that's kind of the housing related parts of that bill. Carson, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, it's a long and complicated bill, and I'm sure Carson could read you out the complicated lineage of that bill, but related to housing, I think that's kind of the gist of it. If you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think that was great. Actually, the only thing I would add is this, it's part of I think it's a step in the process of trying to align economic development with housing and transportation, all these kind of core things. This is obviously, like Ashley said, a really complicated kind of a niche policy. We're doing a training on it for an hour and a half here in a little bit. So we'll do a deep dive. But I think that the key takeaway with this bill is that we're trying to align all these big picture things and have local governments and state and counties all sort of orchestrated in efforts to plan for growth in a rapidly changing environment.
So that brings us next to HB 462. So this is Representative Waldrop's Utah Housing Affordability Amendments, and this was largely referred to as HB 34 or SB 34 plus. So if many of you remember the implementation of the moderate income housing plans, so I think it's, Carson, remind me, is it 82 cities and towns have to comply?
Yeah. So, and then there's a number of counties and metro townships as well. It's based on population and classification, but most, like, I think if I remember right, we looked at the analysis a few years ago, more than 80% of the state's population falls within cities that have to comply or counties that have to comply with that, with the SB 34 framework.
Yeah. So again, a really kind of complex bill, but as well, I just kind of to highlight a few of these things. First off, they enhance some of these implementation or some of these tools, right? So a city has to do so many menu items in their plans. And so a lot of those menu items have been tweaked. So instead of you consider certain things, cities have to implement things. So there has to be more action on some of your items. So it puts a little bit more teeth into it for cities. You have to do a little bit more to prove what you're doing. There's a couple new added items that a city can entertain or can include in part of their plan. So you can create an HTRZ or housing transit reinvestment zone, eliminate impact fees for ADUs, or you could also, with multiple jurisdictions, combine resources to acquire land for moderate income or low or affordable housing, allow for reduced regulations for certain housing projects, which a city could define. Couple more things, but those are some of the new ones. As far as the moderate income housing reports that go to DWS, some of that has shifted. So they're now required by October 1st. There's going to be a greater requirement of explanation of how those tools were implemented, like what tools a city implemented, how effective they were there obstacles that they faced in implementing certain things, building permits that were issued, licenses issued for accessory dwelling units. If you all remember last year, HB 82, cities have to allow internal accessory dwelling units. And I think what the state is now trying to get at is, are those having an impact on our housing crisis? So by allowing ADUs unilaterally, not unilaterally, there are still some exemptions, but by on a wider scale, allowing these ADUs, is that cutting into our housing deficit? The penalties for not doing these or for not putting your plans together is still the same. Basically, if you have to put your plans together to be available for certain state transportation funds. One of the things that the state did add this year is, if a city without fixed rail has 5 items, or if a city with fixed rail has 6 items, you're then prioritized for that funding. So for that state transportation funding. And I think there's also a new provision in there. If you remember, Governor's Office of Planning and Budget has still some ARPA dollars, some federal ARPA dollars that is pushing through the state that cities can apply for. You can also have access and prioritization to that if you complete your moderate income housing plan above certain levels. DWS, Department of Workforce Services, is now going to create a database for moderate income housing units, which will provide a better understanding of where housing units are and how many there are across the state. This bill, there's a couple of other things within this bill, but I think the other things that were in here was, this was one of the big funding pieces. And so there was going to be $50 million for gap financing for private activity bond projects. And there was also going to be $50 million for rural workforce housing. Both of those were nixed from the bill. unfortunately. You know, it was a big push. There were certain things that made it into the bill. There was money, and I'll talk about the money that we did get for housing, but those were not in the bill. Also, not everything removed from the bill was anything on short-term rentals. There was some discussion about short-term rentals, but nothing was in this bill for that. The big funding piece for housing this year was SB 238, Senator Andrigg, Homeless Services Modification. So this basically establishes a grant program that will be housed in the Office of Homeless Services, and it's $55 million for deeply affordable, so 30% or below. And part of the benefit of having this run through Wayne's office, the Office of Homeless Services, and Wayne Niederhauser, is there's going to be, if you're doing projects for 30% and below, our services required, or certain services, or case management, or other kind of services required. And so they're going to make sure, if they are required, that they are included within that plan. So I think having it under Wayne's office supervision, I think will be extremely helpful, because I think there's going to be a great accountability for that. How well is the money, where is the money going? How well is it being used? What kind of dent is it making in our big, our housing crisis? Originally, there was $128 million initially requested. And so 55 out of 128 doesn't seem like a lot, but I think everybody has to remember this is the most substantial investment the state has provided, not only for housing, but for deeply affordable housing, really specified deeply affordable housing. So a lot of us up on the Hill were really disappointed when we saw that final number, but it's a huge number. A lot of really great programs did not get funded this year, even though we had surpluses and we had a lot of federal dollars. A lot of really great things did not get funded. So I think it's, more is always better, but this is a good sum to start with. And I think the biggest, what has to happen now, or what should happen now, is making sure that these funds are used in a great way and that they get used quickly. And then we can come back and prove that, hey, okay, this was not enough, we need more. So I think that's kind of what my hope is, and what the next steps are. Kind of just ran through that really quickly. If I missed anything, or if there's any questions, Carson.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think these are all big pieces that are interconnected. And again, just trying to keep it at the high level since we don't have a ton of time. But I think it's important to know that these are, I think, steps in a bigger, I lost my analogy midstream there, but I think these are all still ongoing. And I think there's a lot of room for conversations to keep happening at the now subgroup on housing affordability, both on the funding piece and on the policy piece. I know that there's still a lot of work to do. And I think my advice is to keep, it's unfortunate the legislature didn't fully fund some of these asks, but I think there's a concerted need to keep pushing for that and keep identifying where the money's going and the need for additional revenue, especially for deeply affordable housing.
Yes, thank you both so much. And one of the bills that I had not included in my initial list, I don't know if either of you feel ready to speak just very briefly about it. It's House Bill 303, the inclusionary zoning piece. Carson, do you feel comfortable talking about it? If not, we can make an update later.
Yeah. So House Bill 303 became the land use task force consensus, more or less, bill. And then there was a provision inserted sort of at the last minute that was intended to authorize inclusionary zoning in a narrow channel. Initially, we had heard from the Property Rights Coalition, who includes home builders and developers, a lot of concerns about how inclusionary zoning's been applied around the country. And there were concerns about how that would impact market rate housing prices. We had spent a lot of time, we being the league and local government, spent a lot of time talking with them about the Florida model, which says, to remember exactly how that works. But the Florida model is kind of upheld as like the consensus legislation, but it's kind of actually broken a lot of stuff for how local governments implement inclusionary zoning there. They require a standard of completely offset any cost the inclusionary zoning ordinance would impose on a developer or property owner. When what we've heard from them is that basically just doesn't work. It's almost impossible to implement ordinances knowing that you have a huge outstanding liability. So what we did this year, again, kind of had a breakthrough at the last minute, was to sort of try to push inclusionary zoning to development agreements. That does take some of the teeth out of it. And there is an exception for resort communities. So Park City has a really robust inclusionary zoning program. They'll be able to continue that. It's working really well. But if you're a new city who wants to start wading into that, you will need to offer either some incentives or just do it through a development agreement. A lot of these big, either multifamily or large subdivision projects are done through development agreement now anyways. So it's not a huge shift. And some cities are already starting to implement inclusionary zoning sort of softly through development agreement. So the intent with that was to try to authorize it because it was never authorized in state law before. So give local governments a little bit more power to start doing it, while creating some guardrails to try to protect the interests of the Property Rights Coalition and property owners.
Thank you so much, Carson. Really appreciate, and thank you, Ashley, as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, I would like to do Q&A now with Ashley and Carson if you have questions, because they have to be at a meeting at 12. So they might not be they might not be with us the whole time. There is a question in the chat, but I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. Oh, Steve Erickson, Carson, will Utah League of Cities and Towns be training cities on this inclusionary zoning provision in HB 303?
That's a great question. I don't think we'll be training on that bill specifically. We touched on HB 303 when we offered a training for kind of a catch-all planning and housing issues or a legislative update for our planners, city attorneys, folks who'll be implementing it, some electeds. So I don't imagine we'll be doing a lot of training on that specifically. I think that will require a lot of sort of figuring out, like kind of testing the language, testing the politics. I think, and I've talked to a number of builders who are actually sincerely interested in starting to look at some inclusionary zoning, but they're sort of anxious about how a mandate would look. So yeah, and the fee and lieu is a good question, and whether that applies to, because some cities impose that around the country, some cities impose that on commercial developments and not on residential developments, which this is targeted at. Again, if you have a grandfathered program like Park City, I think they're fine to continue, but it really just depends on how it's structured and how cities interpret the law.
And the second question is from Steve, could cities implement fees in lieu under this restriction?
Oh, sorry, I think I missed the first. Oh, I think I answered the second question first. But yeah, I think, again, depends on how it's structured, because that's kind of a nuanced question. And Steve, feel free to reach out to me and I can kind of walk you through the rationale. But I'm going to give you a really bad answer and a maybe, depending on how it's designed.
Thank you, Carson. Then we have a question from Paul Davis. Why was SB 238 restricted to new purchases since they are existing facilities which have been benefited? We really need help with case management.
So I'm looking through the language now, and it doesn't necessarily preclude old projects, because as what it says shall. So when reviewing an application for approval, the Homelessness Council shall consider the rental income plan, the proposed case management and service plans for households, any matching funds proposed restrictions, including deed restrictions, and the duration of restriction on the housing. So I don't see where it says it has to be a new building. I think it's drafted that they should be new projects or purchase of existing, but maybe that would be clarified in rule. And maybe that's a question that could go through Wayne's office. Is there intention to allow existing projects? Because I could see it, if they're already deeply affordable, do we want to continue to fund things that are already built or put money towards new? Or is it to help maintain existing deeply affordable, right? And I think both of them are important. That might be, and the statute doesn't clearly, in my mind, define it either or. I think it leans more towards new, but it doesn't say it can't be. So that maybe is something that can be defined through rule. And a question that should be asked maybe to Wayne's office of Homeless Services. Maybe you could answer directly to Wayne, or I don't know who, or Trish Davis. But his office would be there. That's the rulemaking is going to go through them.
Yeah, and sorry, Ashley, but I think also there's other funds for the case management. And yes, case management has been underfunded for years, but I do think we also need not just the existing projects, but frankly, we're so far short of units that we do need projects, whether that is just revamping an existing building, not necessarily building a new project, but I think that was reflected in the decision where this money would be sitting is the fact that we've got to have those units, and developers are not building 30% below AMI. So we've got to have this.
So I saw that Paul Davis has his hands up. I think if for the sake of time, because I want to make sure we get to everybody, Paul, I am more than happy to facilitate a meeting with the experts on this panel today. If you have more detailed questions about what we presented. And like Ashley said, you know, Wayne's office will gonna have to provide the details in the rules. Okay. One of our board members had a question, and I think she was referring to, I'm assuming she was referring to the $55 million. What type of housing projects can be implemented with these changes?
I think, well, the only restrictions now are that it's below 30% or below. So whether it's, you know, an SRO, if it's a conversion of, say, like a hotel motel or something like that, I think the biggest provisions now are that it's below 30%, that there's, you know, there's the requirements of what's have to be there. So I think it's open. And, you know, Jean, unless you have any other comments on that, but I think it's pretty open as long as it's below 30%, you have a case management plan. The units will be deed restricted. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and just a reminder that it's 55 million statewide, so it won't just be Salt Lake County projects, but there is, you know, I think some of the projects that will try and get some of that funding is the tiny home village and hotel conversion.
Okay. Shelley also asked what kind of housing projects can be built with the zoning changes that I think Carson and Ashley, I think this is related to 462, 303, 151, all of those. I'm assuming the question is related, what type of affordable housing projects can be built with those kind of changes done through the legislation?
So I can take a first shot at that if it's all right, Ashley. So HB 462 doesn't actually mandate zoning, well, for the most part, doesn't really mandate zoning changes itself. It still respects the role of local governments to make zoning decisions. What it does say is you have to, well, so you already have, for those 82 cities, you have that moderate income housing plan requirement. What it does is it says you have to now add an implementation element to say, you know, not only are we going to look at expanding the use of accessory dwelling units or expand multifamily, like, you know, there's 20 something items there, but you have to say, they have to create a rough timeline. It's not necessarily a binding timeline, but you have to make a timeline that's committable, that's achievable. And then you have to be able to walk through and say, and if you don't meet that timeline, you have to be able to tell the Department of Workforce Services why you failed to meet that, whether it was because of resident pushback, whether it was because the property owner wanted to do a different project. But that's sort of the framework that we've established. So the zoning changes are up to jurisdictions. I should also mention there's a station area plan component, which is very, very technical in the weeds policy. And I could take the rest of the time talking just about that, but there will be an additional heightened requirement for planning around transit stops and certain BRT stops as well, but bus rapid transit. So you'll start to see some more, and those aren't necessarily just for housing or residential, but there is a residential development and housing is a big component of those enhanced plans. So you'll start to see some changes probably there as well.
Thank you so much, Carson and Ashley. Jean, there is a question in the chat, and I think that's for you, from Michelle Weaver. If you don't mind answering in the chat. I would like to go next to Ginger Chin from the Salt Lake Chamber to discuss the Chamber's priorities related to housing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Francisca. And thank you for having me on today. I always love listening to Carson and Ashley. They've got such great information on bills, and they did such a great job this session doing a deep dive on our housing bills. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Chamber. So many of you are probably familiar with our Housing Gap Coalition. The Housing Gap Coalition was started in 2018, just prior to me being here. But the idea was that many of our members in the chamber said, hey, we have a problem that's coming down. And this was in 2018, keep in mind, and we are going to see a housing gap, and it's going to create an economic crisis in our state. And we need to educate the public on this pending crisis that we're seeing. Well, now fast forward to 2022, we know that we don't need to educate anybody on the crisis. Every day you open the paper and we see these issues just first and foremost in front of us. So we really do see the housing gap and the problem and the lack of supply right now on the market as an economic problem. So during the session, and as Ashley mentioned, a lot of projects weren't fully funded, and by a lot, there were a lot. And so I did a proposal and requested for $3 million, $1 million per year to do a statewide messaging campaign on housing and NIMBYism and how we can overcome some of these issues together. And the idea was, and currently is to convene groups, advocate, do polling, report out on the polling, talk about best practices, and really hone in on phase 2 of this messaging campaign of just, instead of educating about the impending crisis, talk about potential solutions in a messaging campaign. And for us, unfortunately, we weren't successful in getting that money, but I don't see this as necessarily a negative thing. You win some, you lose some. But what we've decided to do, and this was running simultaneously, by the way, Governor's Office of Planning and Budget was awarded $1 million for a statewide conversation regarding growth. And the philosophy here is that we don't just have a housing issue, we have a growth issue. And many Utahns are feeling this guttural reaction to growth. So with this $1 million, we've partnered with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and we're meeting on a regular basis. They've commissioned Envision Utah to have a dialogue about growth and to do some polling and some information to really work with our AOGs and the chambers and other critical partners on talking about the positive aspects of growth and how we can overcome some of the negative aspects to be opportunities versus strictly negative. So that's underway right now, and the chamber is a strong partner in that. And then with that, we have pivoted just a little bit with our strategy. All good things you have to kind of refine and retune. And we are looking at our other chambers. So we're starting an Intermountain West coalition. I've hired an individual who'll start May 2nd. We're starting to look at what other chambers are doing across the Intermountain West and saying, what can we do collectively? And this idea came about because we started to reach out and say, what are other business organizations and associations doing to facilitate the conversation and help with these issues? Because we already know Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, even New Mexico, we're having some of the similar problems. And it became readily apparent that as we are all on this call working to solve Utah's housing problems, if our other states are not in alignment, we are actually solving problems for other states, and we will continue to do so. So we see this issue that we as the chamber can come together with our other chambers in our neighboring states to form a chamber coalition and look at housing from a regional perspective. So that's the direction we're going. We're just starting, but I think it's going to be a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to coming back and reporting out what we're finding, best practices, toolkits, lessons learned, opportunities. One of the things we'd like to do is what I like to call R&D, rip off and deploy. If another chamber is doing something great in housing, maybe we can replicate that and use that for this group as well. So just wanted to share that with you all, and happy to answer any questions. And if you'd like to be a part of this, please let me know. This is all hands on deck.
Ginger, thank you so much about this. And it's interesting because we are the Utah Housing Coalition. We're also looking at our Intermountain partners to create a coalition and potentially have a convention in Salt Lake City. It's absolutely right. The issues that we're facing, Idaho, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona are facing. And I just want to say for the people in the attendance, we do have a very diverse group of people. We have, advocates, policy people, affordable housing developers, housing authorities, mediators, investors, architects. So I'm really happy that everybody joined. And if any of you like to connect with any of the speakers, please reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to, provide an introduction. Thank you, Ginger, so much. Ginger will still be around to answer any questions if you want to put them in the chat. Also, I want to let you know, Ginger is one of our newest board members at the Utah Housing Coalition. So we're very happy to have her with us.
I'm honored.
I'm going to go next to Jen Hill to talk about House Bill 440.
Great, thank you, Francisca, I appreciate it. So I think House Bill 440 got quite a bit of press. It was one of those bills at the end of the session that did a lot and made some folks unhappy and made some folks very happy. And now that we're dealing in the weeds with it, it's kind of making us all still unhappy and happy. But as you know, I think many of you on this know, we as the Salt Lake Valley Coalition of Homelessness have had for the last 3 years to sort of beg cities to help us open overflow shelter and have no power to make that happen. So the goal of this bill was to provide some teeth to the question of overflow shelter siting. And the bill has done that in a way that I think is going to end up being very helpful. And we've already started those conversations with the Council of Mayors, and it's been a good conversation thus far. So it's a big bill. There were a lot of pieces in it. It's 33 pages, I guess, not as big as some, but a good sized bill. I'm not going to go through all of the pieces. I'm just going to talk about that overflow piece, because that is the part that most impacts what we're doing day to day to serve people. What it does is require that overflow be provided from October 1st through April 30th. That's one change that's sort of important as well. We've typically had to close overflow April 15th, so that extra time will make a huge difference as well. It does, however, limit any one overflow shelter to 150 people, and it cannot operate year round. So it has to be truly just overflow for winter. That is something that, we'll have to talk about going forward as well, because we do need overflow shelter now in the summers, especially when it's getting so very hot. Or even better, we need that housing that 55 million might actually provide, so that we can get more people out of shelter entirely and off the streets entirely and into housing. The Conference of Mayors is tasked with developing the plan, and they have to do that in consultation with the coalition and then share that plan with the Council of Governments. So the Conference of Mayors is all of the Salt Lake County mayors. The Council of Governments includes all of those mayors and some city council folks and some others as well. But the Conference of Mayors is the one that has to put the plan together. And to do that, they've asked the coalition to provide data on the need to show how much shelter we're going to need each winter. And then also we're supposed to help select the locations. And that's important as well, because there's a lot of nuance in deciding an overflow shelter. It's not just about finding an empty warehouse. There's transportation concerns. There's concerns about access to services. If an overflow shelter is an hour bus ride away from a person's job, that's a problem. So we have to make sure we're siting these in places that make sense. If the COM does not come up with a plan by September 1, then the overflow discussion moves to the state, and the state can cite an overflow shelter. Unfortunately, there's a lot of conditions on where that overflow could be if the state steps in. And those conditions, sadly enough, are taken from tobacco legislation. So some of those conditions include it can't be within 600 feet of a residence. It also can't be within 1,000 feet. Oh, hold on, I have to find my pieces here. 1,000 feet of a community location. And a community location is a kindergarten or any other school, a childcare facility or preschool, a trade or technical school, a church, a library, a park, a recreational facility, a youth center, which is not defined, or a public arcade. So if the state has to come in and cite an overflow shelter, we limit pretty significantly where those could be. Basically, they can be where tobacco is sold, which is sort of a concerning provision, just because we're talking about people versus a tobacco product. And so we'll have to see how that works. But thankfully, that is only under the preemption. And the way things are going with COM right now, I have great hope that we're actually going to be able to avoid that kind of a situation. If the state has to step in, then the total number of beds can exceed 230. Just sort of an arbitrary number. It doesn't reflect this last winter. We know we needed about 300 beds based on our fall point in time count and historical need. So that 230 could be a significant limitation. Also, if the Council of Mayors does not come up with a plan, then we could also increase capacity at each of the 3 resource centers. And there's limits on how much. It's a 25% capacity limit. I can tell you too, providers impose their own limits because really they do not want those HRCs to be overstuffed. It doesn't help with services. It doesn't help us serve people well if we've got people lying in mats all over the HRCs. And you have staffing issues, as always. So the other piece of this that the legislation doesn't exist is all of it depends on being able to staff these places. All of this depends on having the funds to not only site, but also operate these locations. And the legislation does put in a priority for conversion of a hotel motel for overflow. And that's wise practice, as we've learned with COVID, because non-congregate shelter like a hotel motel does help us ensure public safety, that people are not getting COVID or any other diseases that might be going around during the winter, which, winter is sort of the flu season, huh? So we want to make sure people are as safe as possible. So that hotel motel piece is very helpful in making sure that we can serve people in the safest manner. So that's pretty much the provisions of HB 440 that, again, relate to housing people who are homeless. Oh, the other piece I should say, there were a number of appropriations in the bill. One of those is $1 million for the city that has the overflow shelter. And that money does go to the city, not to the providers, to address any impacts of overflow. So I think what we'll probably see most of that money used for is enhanced law enforcement, but hopefully there may be some other uses as well. Thanks, Francisca.
Jean, I have a question, and I probably should know the answer to this, but if I don't know it, many others might not as well. So it requires a plan from the Council of Mayors. Is there a date on when the plan needs to be implemented?
So the plan has to be given to the Office of Homeless Services September 1 to be approved or not. And then the opening day of overflow is October 1. So it'd have to be implemented by October 1.
For the October 1,
Yeah.
April 30. So it's a quick turnaround, really.
And I should say too, so the Council of Mayors has created a subcommittee to deal with this. And on that subcommittee there's 7 mayors, but also Wayne Niederhauser is on that committee, and members of the Salt Lake Valley Coalition are on that committee. So that we're coming up with a plan that OHS will approve because they've been a part of that planning process. So hopefully, yeah.
Great. And you feel good about the plans that are being put forward?
We haven't had a meeting yet, but I do feel good about who's on that committee and just the initial discussion with the Council of Mayors. There really is a sincere effort to make sure we have a good plan in place before that September 1 deadline. I don't think anyone wants to see the state stepping in to site overflow. And yes, those overflow are only Salt Lake County. The legislation only applies to counties of the first class, and Salt Lake County is the only one of those.
Great.
Thank you so much both for the conversation. And again, if you have anyone in the attendance, if you have questions, please put them in a Q&A, or you can try and raise your hand if you want to ask the question directly. I just want to make sure we stay on time, as we covered so many complex issues. And at the coalition, the staff, we like to say the members are the experts, and this year proved once again that our members are the experts on the issue, and we're just there and we just follow. And if we have to say something, we do. But it's such wonderful work has been done at the Capitol, even if we did not get all of the money that we thought we were going to get in the first place. A lot of good took place. So we have to celebrate the wins. The next thing I want to talk about is something that started at the Utah Housing Coalition, based on everything we've heard from our communities and case managers and advocates, and also our national partners, because the same thing was happening kind of everywhere. So people were receiving eviction notices even during COVID, even during the eviction moratorium. It was not a completely, no eviction whatsoever. And even when the rent was paid through emergency rental assistance or other funds, that eviction stayed on the record, because right now Utah does not have a process in place for expunging the evictions. So we work very closely with Representative Marsha Judkins to have a bill that will create a process within Utah courts for expungement of evictions. So House Bill 359, we're going to take effect on July 1st, and it has 2 components to it. One component applies to evictions filed after July 1st of this year, for automatic expungement of eviction if there is no pending case and the case has been dismissed, and after 3 years, as I mentioned, but also if the two parties stipulate an agreement and they file the stipulation with the court, the expungement can happen as well. The second part of the bill, it's expungement by petition. And it's for evictions that took place for non-payment of rent or lease terminations. And either party can file the petition with the courts, and a process is set up in place that we're going to be established by the courts. So the goal is, once an eviction is expunged from someone's record, it cannot be disclosed anywhere. It is like it never existed. So what we, the staff of the coalition, and other, partners and stakeholders are doing are figuring out how we're going to move forward, how we're going to do the outreach. The courts have to establish the petition process, and this will be done through the self-help office. We also intend to reach out to Utah Apartment Association to have a collaboration, because we don't want landlords or apartment association members to be overwhelmed by requests to expunge the eviction by petition. So we want to work together on this issue. And in some way, we did put Utah on the map. We kind of was done Utah way, I guess, because we had to take in consideration, the laws that we have in place and the court system that we have in Utah and the stakeholders, and was a good fight, but a very good one. We feel like negotiated in good faith. Everybody negotiated in good faith. So we're able to get a big win for the renters. So this year, we feel that will be a lot of trial and error, because we don't know how everything will going to happen. So this is when the reality will kick in, which I guess is with everything else. Once you pass policy, then you start implementing it and you see what happens. And we also were able to secure about $80,000 from the emergency rental assistance. The Treasury provided the guidance that we can do so. And that is to set up the petition process within Utah courts. And we were able to use that money, because the expungement of eviction, it is housing stability for people. And for the next years, when we have to, have this done through state allocation, we'll have to continue to work and advocate and communicate with our legislators and show the good that was done. So that was kind of the big win. There were a few other landlord-tenant related bills that, unfortunately, most of them were not even heard in the committee. Only one of them, sponsored by Representative Daley Provost, was heard in Business and Labor, and it was kind of brutal, to be honest with you. But now we have a public record on the issue. The fact that renters do not have any kind of remedy to address issues related to landlord-tenant laws. So that's kind of my presentation. I see 2 hands up. I'm gonna go first to Paul Davis, and I'm gonna let you ask your question. If you give me just 1 second. I'm gonna have to promote you as a panelist so you can, there you go. Paul, if you wanna ask your question.
All I wanted to do is say, in regards to the Wayne Niederhauser comment, and this is addressed to Gene, the case management was part of the plan, is to pay off the mortgage for, and this is Keith Warburton, of course, you're familiar with him. His motel up here was hopefully pay off the mortgage, and he would contract with us at the AOG for case management. And that would prevent us from having to go back and ask for money every year for case managers. He would pay for it for 10 years because we paid off his mortgage. That was the key. And then I was hoping somebody could comment about the federal mortgage assistance, the mortgage plan that hopefully DWS will be able to have fielded really soon. They had a public input last week, but anybody have any comments on that? It looks like it'll be a good plan, but there may not be enough resources in there to cover all the mortgage assistance issues we have. That's all.
Yeah, so Paul, I'm happy to put you in touch with Stephen Lyon if you have not connected with him. He's the one overseeing the mortgage assistance. And
Well, I've talked to him. That's not an issue. I was in on the meeting and everything. I just wondered if anybody at the Housing Coalition had comments about that.
we are working with our partners on that, and we are just expecting them to make the RFP go public because they're not going to be in-house. They're going to work with community partners. That's all I know. Thank you. The next person that have their hands up is Robert Rourke. So Robert, I'm gonna let you ask your question.
Oh, I apologize. I hit that on accident. But okay. I can say we talked with the folks about the state mortgage assistance, and they're reaching out to all the partners, but I don't have anything concrete. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Anyone else has any other questions, comments? We have 10 minutes, which is unbelievable. I was a little bit afraid in the first half an hour. Well, what I would like to let the group know is that we're going to continue our monthly meetings on Zoom for now, but we are also planning to go and do visits across the state. So the first visit, it will be in Southern 5-county area. We're trying to take advantage of the Utah NARO conference and also the mid-year leagues conference. And we're planning to meet with local elected officials and community organizations that do the work over there, because we have to do the advocacy work year round. That's our goal. Year round, we have to do it. We have to stay on top of it. See a couple of questions. So the question on mortgage assistance, that came with ARPA. So it's for people that could not make their payments on their home loan because of COVID. So Utah received allocation of $66 million. And at the conference, Utah NARO mid-year, I'm not sure. I think the best way is to check out their websites. Susan has a question. Will it be able to continue? I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you want to provide me additional information. How does the public access that? So, Jeff, what I know is that the state is putting out an RFP to partner with community partners. So community partners will gonna provide the mortgage assistance. And I think once that is done, they're gonna do marketing for it.
My understanding was that they were gonna be handled basically like the ERA, the emergency rental assistance, and it was going to include more than just mortgage. It was going to include like property tax and other bills or costs related to home ownership.
That is correct. It's kind of the same thing with ERA. It's utilities along with the rent payment. So Susan, for mediation. So last year we received funds from the legislature for 1 year, and then the Olin Walker Housing Loan Fund was able to provide funds for another year. So definitely we have to come back next year to request funds unless some other magic takes place.
Francisca, I will just add one comment to the question about HB 440 only applying to Salt Lake County. I do know that there are talks about expanding it to other counties as needed. So this was just the first go round with that legislation. So hopefully we might see some similar cooperation across the state.
Yeah, and for Yehemi's question, so before COVID or post-COVID, let's say before COVID, right? Because who knows what happens post-COVID. The only way to access the rental assistance in the state of Utah is to work with the community action agencies and other social services providers that have federal funds. And Jean, you might know more about this, or anyone else in the panel, but funds that come from CDBG or CSBG, I mean, there's all that alphabet acronym of, federal money that provides, but that's very limited. And it has a lot of rules and regulations where the ERA money, it is, you just have to be 80% below AMI. So it's very, very flexible. All the other federal funds have a lot of restrictions. And the state of Utah does not have, doesn't provide money for rental assistance. So we have a lot of work to do. That's why I can't talk about post-COVID yet. We have to see what happens. Well, if anyone else doesn't have any more questions for us, we can end a little bit earlier. I would like to thank our speakers, Ashley Spadafor Mirabelli, Carson Ehlers, Jean Hill, and Ginger Chin, who stayed with us through the end. If you have any questions, you can email me, fblanc@utahhousing.org. I got today a lot of information about all of the bills that Ashley and Carson spoke at the beginning. So we will be posting on our website, and we're going to send the links out through our mass email. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful Wednesday. Bye-bye.